evening. I'm Kathleen James, the Professor of Art, Chakraborty, the Professor of Art History, and you're all very welcome. I'm filling in for Mark Richardson, who sends his regrets. Unfortunately, he got ill at the last moment, not seriously so, I'm glad to report, but enough so that he couldn't be here this evening. And he sends all his best wishes for the occasion. It's my great honor to introduce the no longer so new Professor of Architecture, Hugh Campbell, a familiar face to, I think, everyone in this room already, not least because he earned all his degrees from UCD, including the first PhD in architecture, and because he has been in office, so to speak, for well over a year now. So he is going to give his address, and then I will introduce the respondent, and then we will break up for conversation and celebration. So, with no further ado, Hugh Campbell. Professor Hugh Campbell.
I should say conversation and wine, importantly. We should have something up there, right? I'll improvise. As Kathleen has already intimated, this lecture is long overdue. It's already actually been 2.5 years since I took up the role of Professor of Architecture. Hard for me to believe, actually. And in that time, a lot has happened. My appointment in September 2008 more or less coincided with the collapse of Lehman Brothers. The two events were, as far as I can ascertain, unconnected. However, as we know from Brian Cowan and Bertie Ahern, Lehman's collapse was pretty much the sole cause of all the economic and social woes that this country has suffered ever since. On so many levels, it might be said that this period has been one of rather drastic contraction. Contraction of capital, of construction activity, of wealth, but contraction also of opportunity, of ambition, maybe sometimes even of hope. However, and without wanting to gloss over the financial challenges facing the university sector, from the point of view of UCD architecture, the view from where I'm sitting, things have seemed in so many ways rather to be expanding. Partly by deliberate design, partly through happy circumstance, the school, as it is to be again, has begun to make connections, form alliances, extend its scope, and broaden its horizons. Thinking about this, I'm reminded of Rosalind Krauss's famous essay on sculpture in the expanded field. Equivalently, I think our task for the coming years is to think about architecture in the expanded field. One might be forgiven then for thinking that an inaugural lecture would be the perfect occasion on which to explore that larger hinterland of architecture, its expanded realm, and the challenges and opportunities which it offers. However, somewhat perversely, I'm proposing this evening to do almost the opposite. Instead of looking outwards, I want to look inwards. Instead of thinking on the large scale, I want to consider the most intimate scale of all. I want to look at the space inside our heads and to consider what it has to do with how we design and how we experience buildings. My rationale for this, to get my defence in advance, is that the inaugural lecture is most often described as an occasion on which to present and make sense of the research and inquiry one has been engaged in up to this point. It is as much, therefore, about looking backwards as forwards. It offers a chance to revisit what might have seemed at times like individual essays and singular endeavours, or strange detours, and to find between them a common thread, a larger pattern. To this extent, this lecture is, to inevitably, I think, autobiographical. And for me, this is doubly the case, as when I look back at what I have been thinking and speaking and writing and teaching about for more than a decade, it is in fact the relationship between the self and architecture which is perhaps the most prominent recurring theme. Put another way, it is the relationship between self and architecture which increasingly defines the relationship between myself and architecture. So what follows is the story of my investigations into the nature and significance of this relationship. The investigation hasn't followed a single trajectory or proceeded at a steady pace, nor can I say that I have yet arrived at any firm conclusions, or even that I am much closer to a satisfactory version of events. For all these reasons, the narrative describing this will have little of the drive or drama of a crime thriller. I can warn you now that there will be few twists and no denouement. Rather, it will be much closer in form to a short story. The greatest living exponent of that form, Alice Munro, said that, quote, "A story is not like a road to follow. It's more like a house. You go inside and stay there for a while, wandering back and forth and settling where you like, and discovering how the rooms and corridors relate to each other, how the world outside is altered by being viewed from these windows." Of course, in trying to construct that kind of house, it does help if you are Alice Munro. But, emboldened by her example, I thought I'd have a go. A few words of warning before I launch into it. Firstly, because I've been around here for a while, as Kathleen also intimated, and have been known to give the occasional lecture, many of you will have heard some of this before, and some of you will have heard a lot of it before. But I suppose I'm depending on the assumption that none of you will have heard all of it before, and some of you will have heard none of it. And secondly, I want to warn you that this will probably not come across as a lecture about architecture in any traditional sense. Why would it? I would tend to think of it rather as a lecture for architecture. So for the next 40 minutes or so, I'd like to show you around some of the rooms in this particular house. And perhaps at the end we can see what the view is like from the windows. That's not supposed to happen. Ah, yeah, there we are. A voice comes to one in the dark. Imagine. Joyce may have written the best endings, but Beckett had the best beginnings. These are the opening words of his late prose piece, Company, which was published in 1980. He wrote it between about 1977 and 1980. Being called Company, it is, of course, entirely concerned with a solitary person, an unnamed person, prone. The text continues. To one on his back in the dark. This he can tell by the pressure on his hind parts and by how the dark changes when he shuts his eyes and again when he opens them again. Only a small part of what is said can be verified, as for example when he hears, "You are on your back in the dark." Then he must acknowledge the truth of what is said, but by far the greater part of what is said cannot be verified, as for example when he hears, "You first saw the light on such and such a day." Sometimes the two are combined, as for example, "You first saw the light on such and such a day, and now you are on your back in the dark." A device perhaps from the incontrovertibility of the one to win credence for the other. That then is the proposition. To one on his back in the dark, a voice tells of a past, with occasional allusion to a present, and more rarely to a future. As for example, "You will end as you now are." And in another dark or in the same, another devising it all for company. This opening paragraph, there are 59 in total, one fewer than on a clock face, encapsulates the mood and method of the whole piece. And I've long been fascinated by this piece, Company, and I've often intended to write about it, although this is actually the first time that I have in any great detail. I first came across the work in 1991 as part of a course I did on Beckett at UCD, taught by, among others, Declan Kyrie. This was, I think, in a way, the first postgraduate work that I did. I then saw staging of it, appropriately enough, given that it started life as a dramatics piece, and then subsequently found myself including it in various seminars which I taught from about 2001 onwards. In fact, one seminar group seriously toyed with the idea of staging a version of Company here in the Red Room, in which the audience would be invited individually to lie on their backs in the dark and to be addressed by a disembodied voice. You may be relieved that I'm not going to attempt that this evening. Well, one can find in this piece, Company, all the classic Beckettian devices, the setting stripped to essentials, a limited field of activity, an unnamed, incapacitated protagonist, the telescoping of life into the short interval between birth and death, all rendered in remarkable, lucid prose. Interleaved with this are more lyrical passages of personal memory, which, although addressed to the unknown protagonist in the second person singular, are in fact derived largely from Beckett's own autobiography. I'll come back to one of them towards the end. This is him, you sense, towards the end of his life, looking back, thinking back across the extent of his life. Memories are summoned to confirm his selfhood, but they are summoned from without, addressed to the subject by another. In fact, every aspect of the subject's selfhood is established in this manner, built from without, rather than grown from within. Or more precisely, the self is really produced at the meeting point of those two realms, of the interior and the exterior. Here, midway through the piece, Beckett's subject, by now having designated himself M and his addressor W, summarises the situation. I don't think I'm going to read all of that. M so far as follows. I'll read some of it. On his back, in a dark place, form and dimensions yet to be devised. Hearing on and off a voice of which uncertain whether addressed to him or to another sharing his situation. There being nothing to show when it describes correctly his situation, that the description is not for the benefit of another in the same situation. Vague distress at the vague thought of his perhaps overhearing a confidence when he hears, for example, "You are on your back in the dark." I won't continue with that, but you get this idea that and then toward the end there's this piece where he abandons even the convention of naming. Even M must go. So W reminds himself of his creature as so far created. But W too is creature, figment, devised deviser, devising it all for company, in the same figment dark as his figments. What is of interest here to me is the way in which Beckett dramatizes conscious experience. He opens out what is going on within the head of the protagonist by splitting the self into subject and object, into the devise and the deviser, and then further suggests that it is in fact the devised who devises the deviser in order that he might be devised. It's going to get easier for me after this point. This is the devised deviser, devising it all for company. Thus, conscious experience is presented as a kind of endlessly recursive feedback loop. And we'll see later how prescient this is in terms of some of the current theories of consciousness. But if consciousness has this temporal aspect about itself, it is also presented as spatial in character, its exact extent expanding and contracting according to where this outside voice locates itself. In a dark place, form and dimension yet to be devised, it is precisely the purpose of the self to devise form and dimension, to set limits and establish relationships, to define space. So where then are the limits of the space of the self? When we consider our mind, produced by the brain, housed in the skull, do we feel ourselves like Hamlet, kings of infinite space, a limitless interior realm? Or, on the other hand, does our conscious experience manifest itself as a kind of emanation, an expansion outwards into our surroundings? Perhaps unsurprisingly, my reading of Beckett, I was young, went hand in hand with an interest in Giacometti, Alberto Giacometti. Of course, the two knew one another, and indeed worked together on the first production of Godot. That's the tree that Giacometti made for the production in the background of this image. And even though Giacometti never drew or sculpted Jack Beckett, as far as I know, you feel he should have, or maybe that in fact he did. I'm interested in how Giacometti navigates between the human form, the head particularly, and the space around it. In his wonderful book on the artist, David Sylvester, who you see depicted here, talks about the way in which his work singles things out with great emphasis, and even its very positive awareness of the presence of the space surrounding any solid body does not lessen the intensity of its focus upon the body around which the space circulates. This narrow focusing upon a compact form out there in space, this attentiveness to apparent size at a given distance, produce the hallucinatory sense of nearness and farness, which is probably the most characteristic feature of Giacometti's work. Sylvester describes how Giacometti's tendency, it amounted in fact almost to a physiological condition, not to correct the relative size of things, to take account of how far away they were, means that no matter how close you get, for instance, to one of Giacometti's sculptures, its distance from you does not seem to change. No more detailed information becomes available to the eye, and there's a kind of constant framing achieved through a base or plinth, which is pretty much a constant in all of his sculptural work. Of his painted and drawn portraits, something like the opposite might be said, that no matter how far away the subject seems on the canvas, one seems always to be looking close up. The face hovers in a very shallow depth of field. Everything around the centre dissolves into relative indistinction. The effect, I think, is to allow us to inhabit the space of the sitter, to side with them. You almost feel the same relationship with their nose, and Giacometti was obsessed with noses, with their nose as you do with your own, and with the hinterland of your face, your cheeks, felt but unseen, sliding back towards your ears, dimensions and edges palpable but indistinct. In looking at these, I'm actually reminded a little bit of some of the recent portraits made by Platon, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Platon, photographer of people in power, in which he gets so close that they actually become, their facial, their features and the proportions of them become relatively unfamiliar. There's a sort of indecent intimacy about these pictures. Sylvester's description of Giacometti's working method as connecting, quote, an often extreme rapidity of execution to an extreme persistency of effort is confirmed in the pages of James Lord's short memoir, A Giacometti Portrait, where we read his description of sitting for a portrait over a series of months, each day coming back to find the artist erasing the work of the previous session in order to begin again on what he declared the futile task of creating a meaningful likeness. Lord talks about having to cancel numerous aeroplane tickets and appointments back in his home in New York in order to keep coming back to Giacometti so that he could embark on this futile task. And this, at the end of every session, he takes a photograph of the portrait in its current form. Is it just as a result of this constant process of erasure and overlay that his heads acquire these distinctive penumbras of painted space? Or might this ambiguous boundary be interpreted as, on the one hand, a reflection of the difficulties for the painter in rendering what is seen? This is just a quote where he's talking about this difficulty. He says, "You never copy the glass on the table. You copy the residue of a vision. Each time I look at the glass, it seems to be remaking itself. That is to say, its reality becomes uncertain, because its projection in my head is uncertain. You see it as if it were disappearing, coming into view again, disappearing, coming into view again. That's to say, it is really always in between being and non-being. And that is what one wants to copy." So that, on the one hand, contributes to this strange penumbra of space. And on the other hand, I think there's an effort to make a depiction of the shifting, uncertain dimensions of the self itself. Now, while in these existentialist studies, the self is the subject of intense, uninterrupted concentration, there's really nothing else but that. For me, what progressively became more interesting in terms of my research was the question of how the sense of self is framed more definitely by space that surrounds it. At first, my interest was in the intimate spaces of domesticity and of creative work. I looked, for instance, at Francis Bacon's studio, and was influenced very strongly by the work of Kieran Benson and others who talk about the idea of the spatial self, that the self is something that is constructed. It is as much a location, as Ron Carré hints, as it is a substance or an attribute. I looked also at the world of Pierre Bonnard, his house in Le Cannet in the south of France, and particularly these extraordinary self-portraits that he made late in his life, staring into the mirror, the painter reduced to this floating, flayed presence. Then in 2000, I remember being struck by, well, this image and images like it. This is Cathy Freeman. People will remember ran and won the 400 metres. It was a huge event for the Australian people. And the moment when she won, there was this kind of tumultuous reaction resonating through the whole stadium. But it was very striking that she was crouched in the middle of the track, completely and utterly alone, with no connection at all to what was going on, the space or the sound or the emotion of what was going on in the space around her. And I was interested in that, and the capacity of the self to withdraw or to live separately, if you like, from what surrounded it. And then at a certain point she kind of snaps out of that and kind of rejoins the lived space, if you like, of the moment. So a lot of my subsequent work was spent trying to think about the ways in which this intimate sense of self and the intimate scale of the self could be sustained in the larger settings of cities and landscapes. And also thinking about, because I suppose in terms of Freeman, what was interesting as well was that the cameras were all able to capture this moment. They were able to zoom in on every detail of her reaction, even though it was essentially a private moment. So I was interested in those paradoxes, if you like. And some subsequent work, I was looking at how that played out in various artistic depictions, mostly portraiture, mostly urban, as in this work by Philip Lorca de Corsia, which are images that he made using a telephoto lens and strobe lighting setup in Times Square in New York, where he's making these portraits. Unwittingly, these people are stepping into the limelight, so to speak, and having an instant of their private life in the city, I suppose, immortalized. And these are very large photographs. They're printed at something like 40 by 60 inches. But they're given a kind of heroic dimension, if you like. And in thinking about those, I suppose inevitably I was led back to, I don't know, yeah. There's an interesting instance that happens where this man, Erno Rosenzweig, who's an Orthodox Jew, is looking through the catalogue of this exhibition and sees himself and is appalled because he feels like he's lost control of his image. There was no consultation with any of the sitters, if you like, for these portraits. There couldn't be. But he subsequently sued de Corsia because of this idea of the loss of his privacy that the making of this image entailed. And interestingly enough, he lost. Rosenzweig lost. But it connects back, of course, to the antecedents for this kind of work. Most famously, maybe Walker Evans, who made these portraits of riders on the New York subway between 1938 and 1940, with his camera concealed inside his coat. And then a little bit later, the same kind of idea, Harry Callahan, another photographer, walking the streets, this time shooting automatically from, again, a concealed camera and going closer to the faces. The same sense of a kind of disconnect, an odd disconnection of scale. You know that the city is the only place where these kind of moments are available, and yet you feel that you're invading somebody's very private realm in seeing them. And then more recently I've been thinking a bit, this is not quite related, but about how that same sense of self is thought about and depicted in essential landscapes, if you like, landscapes of the beach in these images by Richard Misrach, and even just in the idea of a pure piece of view, as in these, this seascape by Hiroshi Sugimoto. It seems like time to talk about architecture. All architecture is what you do to it when you look upon it. Did you think it was in the white or grey stone, or the lines of the arches and cornices? All music is what awakes from you when you are reminded by the instruments. It is not the violins and the cornets, it is not the oboe nor the beating drums, nor the score of the baritone singer singing his sweet romanza, nor that of the men's chorus, nor that of the women's chorus. It is nearer and farther than they. In a lot of my work in recent years, I've been trying to find the right way to say that architecture, as created and as experienced, is a phenomenon that shares many of the characteristic properties of consciousness. What I think it comes down to is this, that in its capacity to give conceptual, functional, sensory and symbolic coherence to mere matter, architecture can be considered analogous to consciousness for the way that consciousness confers coherence and continuity upon the raw data of experience and sensation. And just as consciousness is understood as something quite separate and distinct from the mass of neural activity which ultimately produces it, so architecture must ultimately be seen as something over and above the physical facts of its existence. I might just go back to the Pantheon. Why not? In the process of coming into being and in how it is experienced, it is, in Whitman's terms, nearer and farther than they, nearer and farther than the physical facts. Imbuing space with form, purpose and significance is central to the activity of architecture, and discerning those same properties is, in turn, critical to the meaningful experience of architecture. These properties might be regarded as integral to the very fabric of the built space. but they may also be seen as aspects of a quite separate and distinct, unifying, conceptual, or ideational, is an awkward word, an ideational force. The space of the Pantheon, for instance, can be explained as a circular domed enclosure of certain dimensions and certain materials, lit centrally through an open oculus. But something more than that is communicated by the space itself, a higher organizational idea, a proposition about a spatial order, which is simultaneously abstract and embodied. The physical facts of the building are the only phenomena verifiably present, so the quality must derive from them, and yet it seems of a different order and type. Architecture, therefore, is born of, but ultimately distinct from, building. It is worth noting how, in Whitman's phrasing, that redundant repetition of the it, all architecture is what you do to it when you look upon it, seems to replicate the manner in which we must trip over the facts of building to get to the mental phenomena of what we do to it when we look at it. So, architecture, I'll leave that bit out. This brings me to consciousness. The field of consciousness studies, I'm saying this in confidence that there's no experts in consciousness studies in the audience, so I can speak freely, which spans everything from neuroscience to philosophy, which I suppose increases the chances of there being experts in the room. And it's a field which has expanded enormously in the past 2 decades. There are 2 problems which tend to dominate a lot of the discussions in this field. The first is what's called the binding problem, the question of how it is that from the sum of ceaseless neural activity in the brain, a coherent and continuous sense of self can, without effort, be assembled, bound together, and sustained. How is it that I continue to be I through everything I encounter every day? The second problem, the so-called hard problem, as if the other ones were not, refers to the challenge that even if we could explain every single aspect of brain activity, we would still not be able to isolate and account for the sensation of conscious experience. This hard problem has created a kind of fault line within the field, with on the one hand people who are called Mysterians, they're called that by themselves, including figures such as David Chalmers, who want to assert that consciousness is in fact a distinct and separate phenomenon and must be thought of as such. And on the other hand, there are the materialists, who argue that it is the very conditions which produce conscious experience that also create the compelling illusion that it must emerge from somewhere else. This is the famous ghost in the machine to which Gilbert Ryle referred in The Concept of Mind. This, we might think back to Beckett, is the devised deviser devising it all for company. Following Ryle, generations of materialist theorists have been at pains to disavow the presence of any such ghosts, even while acknowledging that there is something deeply counterintuitive and difficult to grasp about the idea that there is nothing more to our conscious experience than the sum total of millions of neurons firing. When Francis Crick proposed as much, he had the perspicacity to label it the astonishing hypothesis. In his magisterial book, Consciousness Explained, Daniel Dennett, he really does explain consciousness in the book, Daniel Dennett, one of the most dedicated of all materialists, chips away methodically and relentlessly at the intuitions and folk psychology which make the astonishing, actually there's more of that, the astonishing hypothesis so hard to accept. The real difficulty is that we consider consciousness not just as the sum total of the activities of thinking, acting, sensing and remembering and so on, but as our ongoing awareness of this activity. Our sense of self and our conscious experience seems to be fundamentally premised on this capacity always to be aware of our own being, to appreciate automatically what the neurologist Antonio Damasio calls, quote, the feeling of what happens. In the traditional view of consciousness, as Dennett characterizes it, there must be some, what he calls a central meaner, overseeing and directing mental activity. Sensations and thoughts, although evidently the result of brain activity, must get played out in the Cartesian theatre before they can properly become part of consciousness. In place of this Cartesian dualism, Dennett elaborates what he calls a multiple drafts theory, in which, as he writes, there's no single definitive stream of consciousness. There are instead multiple channels in which specialist circuits try, in parallel pandemoniums, to do their various things. I'll hit that again. Creating multiple drafts as they go. Unity of consciousness, in other words, is an illusion, albeit a powerful one. Consciousness, for Dennett, is, quote, gappy, and discontinuous, given stability only by an evolving centre of narrative gravity, which allows our mental activity to coalesce around certain patterns and thus produce this idea of a coherent, continuous self. Rather than having any originatory status, self is something continuously enacted through perception and experience. While I've been talking, that's probably inordinate length about that, we've been looking at these drawings made by Santiago Ramon y Cajal, who's the father, I suppose in many ways, of modern neuroscience. And these are made from slides using, I can't remember, there's a method of staining called Gogli, which uses a kind of metallic stain, and which then he had to draw from. There was no way of making images from those microscopic slides at the time that he was doing this work. So these are these extraordinary images of individual patterns of neurons, neural activity in the brain. And one of the things I think that emerged from Cajal's investigations at the early part of the century, he talks about it, he says that each cell has multiple branches covered with what he calls frost, embracing an amazingly large space with their undulations. A slender fibre that originated from the cell, elongated over enormous distances, and suddenly opened out in a spray of innumerable sprouting fibres. For the psychologist Nicholas Humphrey, there is an evolutionary logic also to the emergence of consciousness. As the processing of perception begins to happen at a remove from the site of its generation, in other words, as central brains begin to evolve in organisms, there's a concomitant development away from immediate responsive action towards reflexive perception. A gap opens between action and reaction, and it is in this gap that sensation and hence self-awareness emerges. Where once there was only the bare capacity to react to external stimuli, there is now an added ability to be aware of and to control that action. Sensation, in other words, is reaction reacted to. In evolutionary terms, the capacity of humans to receive a continuously updated report of our own condition confers clear advantages. Consciousness may be an illusion, but for Humphrey it is a deliberate trick rather than an honest error. A trick which, because it allows us to survive and flourish, becomes increasingly part of our genetic makeup. Now, central to Humphrey's explanation of the idea of consciousness is that it's something, again, that's generated from the outside in. It's about reactions to external stimuli evolving into internal states of reflection. There's this slight distance between the organism and what happens to it. And again, we might remember back to Beckett. Even when we are examining our own actions and mental activity, we replicate the manner in which we examine the world beyond. There's a first-person, second-person relationship even within our own consciousness. In support of this argument, Humphrey details a lot of the recent research on mirror neurons. These are, quote, neurons that link the observation of someone else having a sensation to the execution of a similar sensation oneself. For Humphrey, these mirror neurons are evidence of the outward directed nature of consciousness. If the human brain has produced consciousness as a kind of hyper-evolved version of our reactions to other organisms and environments, it is hardly surprising that it should retain a pronounced capacity for what Humphrey chooses to define as empathy. And now, finally, I'm nearly coming to talk about architecture. It is striking that, in elaborating recent insights from neuroscience, Humphrey would invoke a whole body of work in aesthetics from the late 19th century, which is known as empathy theory, and which centred on what Mitchell Schwarzer has termed the consolidating perception between object and subject. In empathy theory, the ideas constantly forming and reforming the active mind are explained as attempts to conceptualize the perceived world in the human image. As Heinrich Wulffland saw it, forms become meaningful to us only because we recognize in them the expression of a sentient soul. Instinctively, we animate each object. We read our own image into all phenomena. This gets taken up and then elaborated by Geoffrey Scott in his book, The Architecture of Humanism, from 1914, in which he proposes that the true basis of critical appreciation is the simple idea that we have looked at building, he said, and identify ourselves with its apparent state. We have transcribed ourselves into terms of architecture. The echoes of Whitman here are obvious. Equally, he continues, the whole of architecture is, in fact, unconsciously invested by us with human movement and human moods. We transcribe architecture into terms of ourselves. And picking up on this work again a generation or two later, we find Rudolf Arnheim in his idiosyncratic book, The Dynamics of Architectural Form, from 1977, seeking to establish similar parallels between bodily dispositions and built forms. More interestingly, for my purposes though, Arnheim argues that thought itself had formal characteristics in common with architecture. All good thinking, he said, can be said to aspire to the condition of architecture. He elaborates, since all human thoughts must be worked out in the medium of perceptual space, architecture, wittingly or not, presents embodiments of thought when it invents and builds shapes. Recently, I have begun to think of photography as the medium through which this perceptual space, which according to Arnheim is the shared realm of architecture and conscious thought, or at least of good thinking, I think that photography is the place where that perceptual space might be most fruitfully revealed. Through a graduate seminar I've been teaching called Space Framed, teaching with Alice Clancy, and a series of conference papers, I've been investigating how the philosophy and practice of photography has applied itself to the depiction of built space. The image of the Pantheon by Thomas Struth, which we've been staring at for a good while now, is in fact a perfect example of this, a perfect example of a photographer's deliberate interest in the portrayal not just of the space itself, you might say, but also of the originating idea of that space and of the way in which it is understood and experienced. In a lot of Struth's other work, you get this same play between a space, a portrayed space, and somebody standing in another space looking at a portrayed space in that space. There's this kind of doubling and tripling up, as in this portrait of him with the portrait by Dürer, of Dürer. I'd like to conclude this lecture, you'll be happy to hear, by looking a little more closely at two recent examples of the depiction of the architectural interior. In both cases, these photographic works stand as images in their own right. Each forms part of an established and distinguished artistic practice. And in each case, the architecture portrayed also exemplifies a very particular philosophy and sensibility. So already there's a kind of dialogue possible between those different but related photographic and architectural intentions. At the same time, I'd suggest that both these sets of images also pay attention to the phenomenological qualities of the spaces they depict. They are interested in conveying what it is like to be in them, or even, thinking back to the precepts of empathy theory, what it is like to be them. They might each be considered as composite spatial portraits. The first series I want to talk about is work by Candida Hofer, who's a German photographer well, I'll talk about it in a minute, and then these images are by a Swiss photographer called Walter Niedermeyer, both made in the last few years. Candida Hofer is the most senior of the so-called Dusseldorf school of photographers. You can see her in the back of this image by her. Along with Thomas Roof, Thomas Struth and Andreas Gursky, she was among the first to be taught in Dusseldorf by Berndt and Hille Becker. From the Beckers, she inherited a commitment to the extensive documentation of specific architectural types and to a straight, objective mode of picture-taking. Since the mid-80s, she has almost exclusively dedicated herself to photographing public and institutional interiors, sometimes domestic interiors as well, as in this image of the Schindler House. She works initially with a 35mm camera, and then she moved to a 6x6 Hasselblad from 1994, and then more recently she's used a larger format camera again. At each stage, the change in the equipment has allowed her to increase the size of the prints and in a way to increase the formality of the kinds of images that she makes. So that she moves from making these kind of diagonal shots across space to frontally disposed, symmetrical, single-point perspective images, very large. But though the technique has matured, the subject matter has remained constant. Hofer is interested in the sober, scrupulous depiction of interior space. While her chosen spaces vary significantly in type, size and age, although she does an awful lot of very extensive series, for instance her series on libraries, they're almost invariably depicted absent of people, but full of the signs and the equipment of occupation. Many commentators on Hofer's pictures have drawn attention to their qualities of stillness and quietude, and also to a slight feeling of distance or absence which they induce. In fact, one of her most major exhibition publications was called The Architecture of Absence, and in that book Mary Kay Lombino describes the work as achieving complete clarity and evoking detached tranquility. At the same time, she evinces the photograph's ability to give, quote, to give blankness and emotional plenitude. So these are pictures which, in depicting empty spaces, are paradoxically full of presence. In fact, it is their quality of emptiness which makes them so vividly present. They seem to invite occupation. And Michael Fried has talked about these pictures recently, and in fact he talks about them as being very absorbed pictures. I'm not going to go into that, it's to do with his own theories about the artwork. But Hoffer herself has talked about the pictures as being more static, more in themselves, sitting in themselves. And the pictures that I want to talk about from Hoffer are a series that she made over a number of visits to the Neues Museum in Berlin, which is just recently, I suppose, rebuilt by David Chipperfield and Julian Harrop. David Chipperfield spoke about this project in Dublin last November. And these images were made in between the finishing of the work and the inhabitation, if you like, of it, with the display cases and all the artefacts, and indeed the people that subsequently moved in. In the specific case of the Neues Museum, this quality of absorbed attentiveness means that the building's layers of history resonate strongly through the images. In dealing with the building, Chipperfield's overall strategy has been clearly to distinguish between existing fabric and new additions. But it is in fact where the clarity of this distinction breaks down that the architecture becomes most powerful. Responding to a question about making decisions on value and hierarchy on site, Chipperfield seemed to abandon his usual position of detached conceptual clarity and spoke of his many close-up encounters with the fabric of the building and of being faced ultimately with trying to find the point at which all the inert material, new and old, from which each of these spaces is ultimately composed, comes to life. It's precisely these moments which Hoffer's pictures reveal. That's the conceptual clarity, sorry, a little bit behind. And this is the space coming to life. With one key addition, which is this, which is the bust of Nefertiti, which is one of the most extraordinary, certainly the most extraordinary thing in this museum. It's a painted figure from, 4th century BC, more. But it looks like, she looks like she's there in the room. She looks like she's conscious to all intents and purposes. The second example that I want to talk about is a series of diptychs made of the works of Sana, the Japanese practice of Sejima and Nishizawa, by the Swiss photographer Walter Niedermeyer. By contrast with the formal restraint of Hoffer's work, Niedermeyer's images seem more overtly concerned with atmosphere and feeling. This is the first, I saw these pictures as this in the single in Antwerp in 2007, I think, where they were first shown. He has spoken about this work, and he's spoken about how his practice has moved from a documentary approach, as he would see it, which I suppose would align with Hoffer, to being about forming and representing an impression of space. Niedermeyer had initially become known for his large-scale images of skiers and climbers moving through alpine landscapes. I don't know if people know. Well, that's not much use to. These are very large, you saw from the exhibition shot before, multiple images in which actually there's an element of time because you see the same figures moving through each of the frames of the landscape, like a story. But his emphasis is on the vastness of the landscape and the relative size, I suppose, of the figures within it, and trying to use photography to render that. He explains that nothing in the image should dominate, so that all the elements have the same valence and visibility, from people to objects and architectural structures. Niedermeyer makes multiple technical adjustments at every stage of the photographic process, prolonging exposure times, using strong filters, lightening the print during development, reducing colour densities while enlarging the images. All in the service of trying to get closer, as he would see it, to an essential spatial and mental experience. This is him talking. The most exciting moment is always when you are perceiving the space with all of your senses, and the image or the idea of the image takes shape in your mind. Then comes the making of the picture, Niedermeyer explains in a 2003 interview. This experience of space has nothing to do with architecture. An architect, he says, kind of surprisingly, would probably have no interest in my images as documents of his or her work. But Sana do. And Niedermeyer has acknowledged that he finds in their practice an equivalent sensibility and aesthetic. He refers approvingly to what he calls the densified simplicity of their work. Sana in turn enjoy the way in which these pictures seem to get back to the underlying idea of the architecture, to the initial dream of what these spaces might be like. Here's Nishizawa saying, sometimes we're surprised by the images and that they get to somewhere that is very much our work but not before seen by us. Because we share a sensibility, the photograph always has some strong connection to the purest intentions of the work. For Sejima, architecture often corresponds more closely to what she sees in the mind's eye than to the finished building. That might be seen as a problem. It is as if she wants the building to remain always on the edge of becoming. One finds echoes of this attitude in the work of their contemporary, Sue Fujimoto, who in his text, Primitive Future, spoke of making what he calls an in-between architecture. He refers to the Cistercian, I'll just look at that for a minute, he refers to the Cistercian monastery of Leatherbarrow, which I didn't expect to be ending up showing, but there we are. In Leatherbarrow, he says, it's difficult to understand if the light came first or the stone came first. That is because it may be a state prior to division into light and object. To make architecture is perhaps to produce a primal unified condition, just before the division into light and object, space and object, natural and artificial, inside and outside, city and house, large and small. This is primal and simultaneously diverse, lucid and simultaneously utterly incomprehensible, which might be said of that as well. And finally, in both these cases, I hope that something of the rhyme between built space and photographic space has become clear. But I think too that it is also possible to discern a larger resonance between the perceptual space that is thus produced by that meeting and the feeling of conscious experience. Thus, Niedermeyer's images might be seen as the embodiment of Humphrey's thick moment of consciousness, a floating evanescence of sensation. Hoffler's images, on the other hand, single rather than paired, symmetrically organised around the centre rather than dispersed towards edges. They seem born of a wide-awake world in which everything is lucid, deliberate, knowable. One set of images, you might say, reveals a prevailing sense, the other an animating idea. Consciousness, of course, combines both. Out of the ceaseless humming hive of neural activity, consciousness miraculously emerges as something singular, continuous, and accessible. And when the conscious mind meets architecture, it discovers, in the complex ways in which space is animated by idea and illuminated by experience, something like its own echo. A few weeks ago, the biographer of Le Corbusier, Nicholas Fox-Weber, stood here and gave an indecently detailed lecture on the eventful life of the great architect. There were a lot of things that would stick in the memory for anyone who was there. But I was struck, in fact, most forcibly by his recounting of Corbe's reaction as a young man to Milan Cathedral. As Weber told it, Corbusier was just so overwhelmed by the sheer fact and presence of built space that he stayed in the square for 2 days, coming to terms with it. It was as if he was ingesting the whole nature and purpose of architecture at once, and it was as if he was recognizing himself in it. I think when it affects us, architecture does so because in its spaces and in its lineaments, our minds find themselves echoed, amplified, allowed to resonate. From a dark place, form and dimensions yet to be devised, we come to the simple, comforting facts of built space, of form and dimension, of light framed, of memories housed. Having begun with Beckett, let's give him the last words. Bloom of adulthood, imagine a whiff of that. On your back in the dark, you remember. Ah, you remember. Cloudless May day, she joins you in the little summer house, a rustic hexahedron, entirely of logs, both larch and fir, 6 feet across, 8 from floor to vertex, area 24 square feet to furthest decimal, 2 small multicoloured lights vis-a-vis, small stained diamond panes, under each a ledge. There, on summer Sundays, after his midday meal, your father loved to retreat with punch and with a cushion. The waist of his trousers unbuttoned, he sat on the ledge, turning the pages, you on the other, with your feet dangling. When he chuckled, you tried to chuckle. When his chuckle died, yours too. That you should try to imitate his chuckle pleased and tickled him greatly, and sometimes he would chuckle for no other reason than to hear you try to chuckle too. Sometimes you turn your head and look out through a rose-red pane. You press your little nose against the pane, and all without is rosy. The years have flown, and there, at the same place as then, you sit in the bloom of adulthood, bathed in rainbow light, gazing before you. Thank you.
Our respondent, another professor of architecture, one who's been professor of architecture a while longer, David Leatherbarrow from the University of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Professor James, and congratulations, Professor Campbell, with you holding the rudder of this ship of architecture at UCD. I'm sure it's going to follow a interesting and significant course. A talk so eloquent, erudite, and engaging as the one we just heard deserves praise, not commentary. I could easily exhaust the 5 minutes I've been given in expressions of admiration, but fellow teachers, I think that's those in the audience, may find it more profitable for me to extend a few of Professor Campbell's insights toward topics in architectural education, a subject somewhat far from his lecture tonight, but I think near, very close to his concern for self and space. The history of architecture's relationship to universities has always been rather troubled. It's a discipline, of course, but also a profession, a way of knowing the world and of making it, understanding living, and, if you're lucky, making one. The concept of applied science, well known in our universities, doesn't really reconcile these two poles in architecture. Architects often learn by doing, by making, reversing the order of applied science. Teaching architecture requires that its central subjects be addressed. It is its own field. It possesses self-sameness. But the expanded field also enters in, perhaps as Hugh has said, constitutively. The basic premise of modern philosophy, that being is always and perforce being situated, has, I think, a corollary, a direct corollary in architectural education. I mean that the work is sustained by the world. Design teaching is enriched by studies in literature, painting, poetry, and a range of other subjects. Surely Hugh's approach and his work show the efficacy of this expansion and, if you will, the centrality of this expanded field. Consider, for example, the topic of facade design. Surely studies of the better works of our tradition help students grasp the relationship between a visible surface and a work's spatial depth. But equally helpful are investigations into modern painting and, as we've seen tonight, photography. Perspectival depth disappeared in the paintings of Cézanne, Braque, and indeed Giacometti. allowing what I'll call, following Hugh, the depth of lived experience to be rediscovered. The three-part structure of all of our experience, the figure, its ground, and self, to be remembered. I think Hugh's use of photography and painting suggests that the structure of space we try to describe and define in architecture was also explored in cognate fields from which students and teachers can always learn. If his term indefinition signals a crisis of the architectural object, it also indicates its engagement with the wider milieu. Two of the courses I offer at my university are for undergraduates. Over the years, I've learned the importance of allowing every student to internalize the subject matter I'm trying to address, whether it be in a course or a studio. Formally speaking, or philosophically speaking, this, I think, has been called the work of appropriation. Hugh's comments on selfhood being, paradoxically, built from without explains why learning depends on discerning and strengthening the connections between the individual and the world. One of my favorite thinkers, Hannah Arendt, explained that her lifelong pursuit of philosophy was motivated by love of the world. Hugh's comment that the self is sustained by the city, I think argues exactly the same thing. But he's also taught us that this form of nourishment is reciprocal, which is why our work in and outside architecture has been and will be sustained by the thought and the humanity to which we've been so wonderfully treated tonight. Thank you very much.